Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to dig into something a lot of you have been asking about, the real story of rural employment in India.
Yeah, it's a topic that's often oversimplified. People have this image of farms emptying out, everyone moving to cities, but the reality is much more nuanced.
Way more nuanced. And that's why we're diving into this research paper, Changing Structure of Rural Livelihood in India.
Great paper, really digs into the data. We're talking decades worth, too, not just a snapshot. The 2001-2011 censuses, those are key, but also the national sample surveys, even the periodic labor force survey up to 2020-2021.
Gives us a real sense of the trends, right? Not just where people are working, but how that's changed over time.
Exactly. And one of the big takeaways right off the bat, India seems to be experiencing what's called the Lewis trap path.
Okay, gotta admit, that name sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah.
Break it down for us. What's the Lewis trap all about?
So picture it as countries develop, typically the role of agriculture in the economy, it shrinks, right? Makes sense. You get more industry services, that kind of thing.
And we assume people leave farming for those better paying jobs in those other sectors.
Exactly. And India's GDP reflects that shift. Agriculture makes up a much smaller portion now. I think it's only around 16% now, a huge drop from like 50% back in the 1950s. But, and this is crucial employment in agriculture, it's stubbornly high. We're talking around 43%, even as recently as 2020, 2021.
So the economy's changing, but the jobs picture isn't quite following the same playbook.
Exactly. More people are staying in agriculture than you'd expect, which contributes to that income gap we hear about, rural areas lagging behind. That's the heart of the Lewis trap. It challenges our assumptions about how development is supposed to work.
Fascinating stuff. And it makes you wonder, when people do leave agriculture, is that always a bad thing? I mean, we talk about moving to better opportunities, but is that always the reality?
And that's where it's crucial to differentiate between, are we talking shift, like a full occupational shift, versus diversification?
Okay, I'm all ears. Break down that difference for us.
All right, imagine this. You're a farmer, times are tough, maybe the harvest wasn't great this year, so you pick up a side hustle, right? Could be selling crafts, driving a rickshaw part-time, something to get you through those lean times. That's diversification. You're spreading the risk.
Makes sense. Having a backup plan, so to speak.
Right. Now, an occupational shift is different. It's your family realizing, look, this farm just isn't sustainable anymore. You pack up, move to the city, maybe you find work in construction, agriculture is not part of your life anymore. Big change.
Totally different ballgame, like dipping your toes in the water versus diving head first. And speaking of diving in, this study really looked at where rural Indians are working over these last couple of decades. What kind of shifts are we actually seeing?
So the data does show people moving away from traditional farming, cultivators, agricultural laborers. Those numbers are down.
So people are leaving the farm, but maybe not as fast as we might think, given those big GDP changes you talked about.
Yeah.
Where are they going instead? This is what I find super interesting.
Get this, the sector with the biggest increase in workers. Construction.
Construction. Huh. That's not exactly what you think of when you picture, like, stable, well-paying jobs, especially compared to, say, manufacturing.
Right. And that's a key question this research highlights. Why construction? Is it a choice, like people are choosing this because the conditions are better? Or is it more like a last resort? Like they don't have the skills for other sectors, so this is what they end up doing.
So maybe that construction boom is a symptom of that Lewis trap we were talking about earlier.
Could be. And those 10 broad job categories they looked at in the study? We'll unpack those more because they reveal a lot about these shifts. But first, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, the pandemic.
Oh, man, talk about a curveball. Well, the whole world shut down. India obviously got hit hard, too. How did that global event shake things up?
So it's like this, just as it seemed, people were steadily moving away from agriculture. Boom, 2020 hits, everything changes. Imagine you're a migrant worker in the city. Suddenly you're jobless because of lockdowns. What do you do?
Right, those lockdowns were intense.
Yeah, so for many, going back to their villages, relying on family land, even if it meant earning less, it was the only option.
Like a reverse migration almost, hitting the rewind button on those big shifts we were just talking about.
Exactly. And the data backs it up. From about 2018 onwards, the percentage of cultivators, it actually increased. So while there's this long-term trend of moving away from agriculture, the pandemic shows how connected people's lives still are to those rural livelihoods, even when it seems like they've moved on.
Wow. This is so much more complex than just looking at, like, which economic sector is growing the fastest. It's real people making tough choices in the face of some major global shifts?
Speaking of choices, that brings us to a question I bet is on your mind, listener. Did leaving agriculture actually make life better for those who made that leap?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Like, it's one thing to see movement between sectors, but does that actually translate to a better quality of life for people?
Right, and that's where the data gets really interesting, maybe even a little counterintuitive. The study looked at this from a couple of angles. First, they zoomed out, looked at the state level, and they found that, broadly speaking, states where people have shifted away from agriculture as their main occupation, they tend to have higher overall per capita income.
Okay, so on the surface, that sounds like a good sign. Higher income, you'd think that means better living standards for everyone.
You'd think so, right. But here's where it gets really interesting. When they zoomed in, focused specifically on agricultural households, the folks who had changed occupations, presumably leaving agriculture, they actually saw an income decrease.
Wait, hold on. That seems completely backwards. If these states are doing better overall, shouldn't the people who were in agriculture be better off when they move to different jobs, not worse off?
Exactly. And that's why this kind of research is so valuable. It challenges those easy assumptions, makes us ask tougher questions. It's not enough to just look at the overall economic picture of a state. You got to look at the household level to understand the real impact of these shifts.
So what's the explanation? Why are people leaving agriculture, presumably for better opportunities, only to end up earning less?
Well, this is where those 10 broad job categories we mentioned earlier, they come into play. Remember how we talked about construction being a big draw for those leaving agriculture?
Right, that seemed like a big takeaway.
Yeah, well, turns out that shift might be a big part of the explanation here. Now, the study, it doesn't have data on wages for every single job, but we can make some educated guesses based on what we know.
Okay, so connect the dots for us here. We've got people leaving agriculture, maybe driven by necessity, right? Things like that Lewis trap we talked about, maybe the pandemic's impact. And they're ending up in construction, which, let's be real, doesn't have the best reputation for high pay or job security, especially in a place like India.
Exactly. And this is where thinking about that difference between occupational shift and diversification, it becomes really important. Someone working a temporary construction gig to make ends meet when the harvest is bad, that's diversification. It can be a vital safety net. But if their farm fails completely, they move the whole family to the city for construction work that might be unstable, poorly paid. That's a whole different story.
Yeah, it makes sense that that kind of shift could lead to an overall decrease in income for those families, even if it contributes to a higher per capita income for the state as a whole. It's like if you average out the salaries of a CEO and their entire workforce, the average might look good on paper, but it doesn't reflect the reality for most individuals.
Great analogy. And it highlights how complex this issue is. It's not just about creating more jobs. We need to be asking what kinds of jobs are being created and whether they offer a genuine path to a better life for people leaving agriculture.
It's about quality, not just quantity, when it comes to those opportunities. So where do we go from here? This study's uncovered some fascinating, albeit kind of worrying trends. What are some of the big unanswered questions that need more exploration?
I think one of the most pressing is why construction? Why are so many people leaving agriculture, ending up specifically in that sector, especially when it doesn't seem to be leading to the economic improvements we might expect?
Yeah, is it just a lack of other options? Is it a perception, right or wrong, that construction jobs are just more readily available, easier to get without specific training?
Those are great questions, and that's why more research is so crucial here. We need to understand what's driving people towards construction, make sure they're making genuine choices, not just being funneled into a sector out of desperation.
But I imagine climate change has got to play a role here too, right? India is already experiencing more extreme weather events, droughts, unpredictable monsoons that can devastate agricultural livelihoods. Could that be pushing people out of farming, even if the alternatives aren't necessarily better?
Absolutely. Climate change is a huge factor. Can't ignore it when we're talking about the future of rural employment. Remember that increase in cultivators we saw during the pandemic. That could be a sign of people clinging to agriculture as a safety net in times of crisis, even if it means accepting lower income.
It's almost like a double-edged sword, isn't it? On the one hand, diversification within agriculture, having those traditional farming skills to fall back on, that can be a source of resilience in the face of things like climate change, economic shocks. But if people are being forced back into agriculture because other opportunities dry up, that could trap them in a cycle of low-income vulnerability.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so compelling, right? It shows us how complex the situation really is, challenges us to think beyond those simple narratives of development. It's not just about getting people out of agriculture. It's about making sure that those who do leave have access to decent work, opportunities that offer a genuine path to a better life. And for those who stay in agriculture, it's about finding ways to make those livelihoods more resilient, more sustainable in the face of things like climate change, global market forces.
Sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all solution, more like a need for a multi-pronged approach that addresses both the push and pull factors influencing rural employment in India.
Exactly. And that's where I think this deep dive becomes so valuable for you, the listener.
Oh, how so? You've given me so much to think about already.
It really is fascinating stuff.
It's like this deep dive has not only uncovered the real story of rural employment in India, but it's also revealed, like, the blind spots in how we often think about development as a whole, you know?
Yeah, and that's what makes this kind of research so powerful. It challenges those assumptions, right? It equips us, all of us, to ask better questions. So instead of just accepting those simple narratives, the listener, you out there, you're armed with the insights to look at the data, look at those big headlines with a more critical eye.
It's like you said earlier, knowledge is power.
That's right.
And in this case, it's the power to see beyond just the surface and advocate for solutions that actually make a difference.
Exactly. More effective solutions, more equitable solutions. That's what we need.
Totally.
And speaking of solutions, it's important to remember that there isn't like a magic bullet here.
Right. No easy answers.
Right. Improving the lives of rural Indians, it requires, a multifaceted approach, one that takes into account all these factors we've been discussing.
So we're talking about like creating more diverse and resilient livelihoods, within agriculture.
Yes.
But then also making sure that those who do choose to leave, they have access to decent work opportunities, ones that offer real potential for growth, stability.
Right. It's both and, not either.
Exactly.
And that means investing in things like education, skills development. We got to promote rural entrepreneurship, strengthen those social safety nets, and, of course, address the very real impact of climate change on these communities.
Yeah, that's huge.
It is. It really is.
It's about, like, creating a future where people have genuine choices.
Yeah.
They have the agency to shape their own destinies, whether they choose to stay in agriculture or pursue opportunities elsewhere.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been an incredible journey. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's been great.
From the Lewis trap to, like, the pandemic's ripple effects and those surprising income disparities.
Yeah, lots to unpack.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
But the best part is, this is just the beginning, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, armed with these insights, our listeners, you can continue to explore this topic, dig deeper into those unanswered questions we talked about, maybe even spark some really interesting conversations of your own.
Exactly. Get out there, read more, ask those tough questions.
And as always, we've included links to the research paper and other resources in the show notes.
So yeah, you can dive in, explore at your own pace.
Exactly.
And hey, if this deep dive has sparked any questions, thoughts you'd like to share, don't hesitate to reach out. Find us on social media. We're at Podcast Handle on all platforms.
We love hearing from you.
We do.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the shifting sands of rural India.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions.
And never stop exploring.
We'll see you in the next one.